The train station was alive with noise. The screech of train whistles, hurried footsteps echoing on the tiled floor, and the indistinct chatter of travelers creating a chaotic symphony. Officer Jake Monroe stood by the coffee kiosk, observing the flow of humanity as part of his routine patrol. At 42, his seasoned eyes missed little, his build lean and sharp, exuding the authority of someone who had spent years on the force. Suddenly, a high-pitched scream cut through the din. "Robbery!" A woman's frantic voice sent the crowd into a frenzy. Heads turned, whispers spread, and passengers scrambled to get out of the way. Jake's instincts kicked in as he scanned the area, his gaze locking onto a figure darting through the throng. The suspect, a wiry man with a hoodie pulled low over his face, was weaving between clusters of people. Jake's muscles tensed, and he launched into pursuit. As the chaos intensified, Jake's sharp eyes caught something peculiar amidst the movement. A frail, elderly black woman in a wheelchair, nervously maneuvering toward the exit. Her hands trembled as she wheeled herself away, her figure oddly disproportionate. A protrusion around her stomach gave the impression of a late-stage pregnancy, but something about it felt off. Jake hesitated, his gut tugging at him. He shifted his focus. The fleeing suspect had vanished into the crowd, but the old woman lingered in his sight. Deciding to trust his instincts, Jake approached her. "Ma'am," he said firmly, positioning himself in front of the wheelchair to block her path. "Stop right there." Her eyes, weary and fearful, darted around as if searching for an escape. "I didn't do anything," she protested weakly, her voice shaky. "I'm just trying to catch my train." Before Jake could respond, a white woman in her early 30s pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with anger. "That's her! She's the one who bumped into me and stole my bag," the woman accused, her finger jabbing toward the old lady. Jake's face hardened. "Is that true, ma'am?" he asked, leaning in closer. The elderly woman shook her head vehemently. "I don't know what she's talking about. I'm just an old lady trying to get by." Jake crouched down, his eyes narrowing as he inspected her. The suspicious bulge in her midsection drew his attention. In one swift motion, he reached out and pulled at the cloth draped over her lap, revealing not a pregnant belly, but a large purse hidden beneath her shawl. The crowd gasped. The accused woman's face crumpled, her feeble protests turning into desperate pleas. "I'll return it. Just let me go, please," she cried, her hands shaking as she clung to the wheelchair. Jake wasn't swayed. "You think you can fool me?" he snapped. His voice carried authority, but his tone carried something darker, an edge of disdain that hadn't gone unnoticed by the growing crowd. Without hesitation, he yanked her from the wheelchair. The old woman fell to the ground with a cry of pain, her thin frame crumpling like paper. The onlookers froze in stunned silence as Jake straightened up, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Get up!" he barked. "You're coming with me." "I can't," the woman whimpered, her voice barely audible. "My legs!" Her words were drowned out by Jake's dismissive scoff. "Save it," he muttered. "We both know this act is just another con." But as Jake hoisted her back into the chair, his hand brushed against her calf. The limpness of her legs was unmistakable. For a brief moment, he faltered, confusion flashing across his face. Could she really be disabled? Shaking off his hesitation, Jake tightened the handcuffs around her thin wrists. "Let's go," he said gruffly, pushing her chair toward the station exit. He didn't notice the murmur of unease spreading through the crowd behind him, nor did he care. As far as Jake was concerned, another criminal had been caught. Unbeknownst to him, this small, seemingly insignificant arrest would unravel secrets and memories he had buried deep within himself. A chain of events that would force him to confront not only his past, but the man he had become. The name of the elderly woman, Ruth Miller, would soon echo in his mind as a reminder of the choices that bound them both in a web of pain, redemption, and sacrifice. Jake leaned against his desk at the precinct, staring blankly at the report he had to file about Ruth Miller's arrest. Her trembling voice and frail appearance lingered in his mind. The image of her tumbling out of the wheelchair, her legs utterly limp, unsettled him more than he cared to admit. But Jake quickly shoved the discomfort aside, letting a familiar wave of disdain take its place. To him, her actions fit into the neat box of stereotypes he had built over the years. Another criminal trying to gain sympathy with a sob story. Still, something about her gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. That birthmark. It was faint but visible, a dark splotch on the back of her neck. The sight of it had triggered a visceral reaction, a wave of nausea and a sharp pain in his temple. Jake massaged his forehead, trying to quell the unease rising within him. He had seen that birthmark before. The memory crept in, unwanted and vivid. Jake was only 5 years old when it happened. He had been a bright-eyed boy, full of energy and curiosity, growing up in the safety of his parents' suburban home. One summer evening, while playing in the front yard, a beat-up car pulled up. A smiling woman with warm eyes and dark skin waved at him, calling him over. "Hey there, sweetheart. Are you lost? Your mom told me to come get you," she had said, her voice soft and reassuring. He didn't hesitate. He was too young to sense danger. The next thing he remembered was waking up in darkness, the air thick with mildew and the sharp stench of urine. The shed was small and cramped, its wooden walls splintered and rotting. He wasn't alone. Several other children, all white and around his age, huddled together, their faces streaked with tears and dirt. Their captors were a couple, a large, intimidating man with a booming voice and a thin woman who always seemed to be on edge. The man, who everyone called Tom, barked orders and dished out punishments with terrifying brutality. The woman, however, was different. She often looked at the children with a flicker of guilt in her eyes. At night, when Tom was asleep, she would sneak scraps of food to the children, her hands trembling as she whispered, "Don't tell him." One night, Jake noticed a birthmark on the back of her neck. It was shaped like a teardrop, dark against her skin. He had stared at it while she bent down to hand him a stale piece of bread. "Why are you helping us?" he had whispered. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because no child deserves this," she had murmured, her voice heavy with sorrow. "I'm sorry." The nightmare had lasted weeks. Jake's parents eventually paid the ransom, and the police stormed the hideout, rescuing the children. But the woman had vanished before the raid, leaving behind only fragments of a memory, a face, a voice, and that distinctive birthmark. Jake blinked back to the present, his hands clenched into fists. Could Ruth Miller be the same woman? The idea seemed impossible. That incident had happened nearly 4 decades ago. The woman he remembered had been younger, stronger. But the birthmark, it was too unique to ignore. His thoughts darkened as he remembered the aftermath of the kidnapping. His parents had tried to shield him, but the trauma burrowed deep. Therapy had helped him function, but it couldn't erase the fear and hatred that festered. Over the years, he had redirected those feelings into anger, blaming people who looked like his captors for his suffering. "Low-life criminals," he muttered under his breath, the words slipping out unbidden. Still, the doubt wouldn't leave him. If Ruth really was the woman from his past, why had she turned to petty theft? And why would someone who had shown him kindness back then resort to crime now? Jake pushed away from the desk and opened the precinct's old case files. The kidnapping had been a high-profile incident, but the lack of photographic evidence frustrated him. Police sketches were vague, and the couple's identities had remained elusive. Yet, the parallels were undeniable. Ruth's approximate age, her frail demeanor, and, most of all, the birthmark. It all lined up too well. But logic and hatred were at war within him. What if he was wrong? What if Ruth wasn't the same woman? Could he risk reopening old wounds and memories for nothing? On the other hand, if she was the one, she had answers he had been searching for all his life. His decision crystallized as he stared at the photo of Ruth attached to the arrest report. He couldn't let this go. "I'll get to the bottom of this," he murmured. With that, Jake resolved to confront Ruth, not as a cop, but as the boy she had once saved, and as the man who needed the truth. Jake leaned back in his car, the engine humming softly beneath him as he waited. He had taken a risk, a big one, by releasing Ruth Miller from custody earlier that evening. On paper, it was a questionable decision, one that could raise red flags if his superiors found out. But Jake's reasons weren't rooted in law enforcement. This was personal. He needed answers, and he was determined to get them. Across the street, Ruth's wheelchair creaked faintly as she navigated the uneven sidewalks of her neighborhood. The area was decrepit, with crumbling facades and broken windows, the kind of place where poverty etched itself into every brick and shadow. Jake kept his distance, the unmarked cruiser blending into the darkened street. He hadn't expected her to go far, and she didn't. Ruth turned a corner and approached a dilapidated house at the end of the block. Its roof sagged, and the paint had long since peeled away, exposing rotting wood beneath. Jake squinted as he watched her struggle to unlock the front door. Her hands trembled, either from age or exhaustion, before the door finally creaked open. She disappeared inside. Jake's grip tightened on the steering wheel. For a moment, he hesitated. He wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't protocol, but the pull of the past was too strong to ignore. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting trash. His stomach churned, but he pressed forward, his hand instinctively brushing the badge clipped to his belt. It was a small reassurance that he still had authority, even as the situation felt increasingly out of his control. When he reached the house, Jake crouched beneath the window, peering through the grime-streaked glass. Inside, Ruth sat in her wheelchair, in the corner of a sparsely furnished room. A single flickering bulb hung overhead, casting long, jagged shadows. Opposite her stood an elderly man. His wild hair and unkempt beard gave him the appearance of someone long detached from society. Jake's jaw clenched. This must be her husband. The man, Thomas Miller, was pacing back and forth, his voice a low rumble of anger that carried through the walls. Jake couldn't make out every word, but the venom was unmistakable. "You think this is enough?" Thomas snapped, holding up a crumpled wad of cash. "This is nothing. Do you know what I've sacrificed for you?" Ruth remained silent, her head bowed. Thomas's voice grew louder. "If you hadn't let those brats escape all those years ago, we wouldn't be in this mess. You ruined everything." Jake's breath hitched. His suspicions were confirmed. The memory of that night came rushing back. The frantic escape, the woman who had shielded him and the other children, her whispered apologies. It had been Ruth. She had helped him escape. But why had she stayed with a man like Thomas? Why hadn't she turned him in? Inside, Thomas's anger boiled over. He grabbed Ruth by the arm, yanking her out of the wheelchair. She cried out in pain as he shoved her to the floor. Jake's fists clenched, his body tensing with the urge to intervene. But he forced himself to wait. to observe. He needed more. Proof. Clarity. Something concrete. "I've given you everything," Thomas roared, his face inches from Ruth's. "And what have you done for me? Nothing but make me miserable. If you'd just kept your mouth shut, we'd be rich." Ruth's voice, barely a whisper, cut through the tirade. "I couldn't let them suffer." Her words struck Jake like a blow. There it was, the humanity he had long ignored in her. Despite her current state, despite the petty theft at the train station, Ruth had once risked everything to save him and the others. Thomas sneered. "You think you're some kind of saint? You're nothing. Just a useless cripple who can't even pull her weight." Jake had heard enough. He straightened, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. He wasn't just a spectator anymore. Before he could act, Ruth spoke again. "I stayed because I was afraid," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Afraid of what you'd do if I left. Afraid of being alone. But I'm not afraid anymore." Thomas's hand raised, but Jake didn't give him the chance to strike. He slammed the door open, the force echoing through the small house. "Police! Step away from her!" he barked, his gun drawn. Thomas froze, his eyes narrowing as he took in Jake's presence. "Who the hell are you?" Jake didn't answer. His focus was on Ruth, who lay crumpled on the floor, her eyes wide with a mix of relief and fear. "It's over," he said softly, his voice steady but laced with emotion. Thomas, however, wasn't ready to give up. His hand darted toward the corner of the room, where a shotgun leaned against the wall. "Don't!" Jake shouted, but it was too late. Thomas grabbed the weapon and swung it toward him. The room erupted in chaos as Thomas swung the shotgun up toward Jake. Time seemed to stretch, each second loaded with the weight of life or death. Jake reacted instinctively, dropping low and steadying his aim. "Put it down, Thomas!" he barked, his voice a sharp command. Thomas sneered, his eyes wild. "You think you can take me down, officer? This is my house, my rules." His finger hovered over the trigger. From the floor, Ruth gasped, her frail body struggling to move. "Thomas, stop!" she cried, her voice cracking under the strain. "Please, don't do this!" But Thomas's rage had taken control. "Shut up, Ruth," he snarled. "This is all your fault anyway." In a split second, Ruth did something that caught Jake completely off guard. With a burst of strength, she reached out, grabbing the edge of Thomas's leg and pulling with all her might. The distraction was enough. Thomas stumbled, his aim faltering. The gun went off with a deafening roar, the shot blasting into the ceiling and raining dust and splinters down on them. Jake seized the opportunity. He lunged forward, his knee driving into Thomas's chest as he wrestled the shotgun out of his hands. The older man fought back with surprising ferocity, but Jake's years of training gave him the upper hand. With a sharp twist, he wrenched the weapon free and shoved Thomas to the ground, pinning him with a knee to the back. "It's over," Jake growled, his breath heavy. He pulled out his handcuffs, snapping them onto Thomas's wrists with practiced efficiency. On the floor, Ruth had dragged herself into a sitting position, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Jake turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Ruth nodded weakly, but her eyes were wet with tears. "I didn't want any of this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to survive." Jake didn't respond immediately. He stared at her, the weight of their shared history pressing down on him. The birthmark on her neck was visible now, dark against her weathered skin. The memories came rushing back in full force. The shed, the fear, the whispered reassurances in the dark. "You saved me," he said finally, his voice barely audible. Ruth's eyes widened, and she looked at him more closely. Recognition flickered in her gaze, followed by a deep sorrow. You were one of the children," she murmured. I didn't know. After all these years." Jake sat back, his emotions a tangled mess. "Why didn't you leave him?" he demanded, his tone harsher than he intended. "Why did you stay with someone like that?" Ruth closed her eyes, her frail hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I didn't have a choice," she said softly. "When you and the others escaped, he blamed me. He shattered my legs in his rage. I couldn't run, couldn't fight, and without him, I had no way to survive. So I stayed." Her voice cracked. "I stayed because I was afraid." Jake felt a pang of guilt as he looked at her. She wasn't the monster he had imagined for so long. She had been a victim too, trapped in her own nightmare. "But you helped us," he said, his voice steadier now. "Why? Why risk yourself for us?" Tears spilled down Ruth's cheeks as she smiled faintly. "Because no child deserves to suffer like that," she said simply. "You reminded me of my own little boy. I lost him years ago, and when I saw you, I thought, maybe I could save someone else." Jake swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. For so many years, he had harbored nothing but hate for the people who had taken him. And yet, here she was, the woman who had shown him kindness in the darkest of times. Before he could say more, Thomas growled from the floor. "Don't act like you're some kind of hero, Ruth," he spat. "You think saving those brats made you better? Look at where it got you. A crippled old thief in a dump like this." Jake glared at Thomas, anger simmering beneath the surface. "You're done talking," he said coldly. He reached for his radio, calling for backup and an ambulance. As the room fell silent again, Ruth looked at Jake with pleading eyes. "I don't want to see him anymore," she whispered. "Please, don't let him hurt anyone else." Jake nodded firmly. "He won't." When the backup arrived, Thomas was hauled away, shouting curses that echoed through the night. Ruth was taken to the hospital, her frail body finally given the care it had been denied for so long. Jake stayed with her, sitting silently by her side as the events of the night replayed in his mind. He knew the case wasn't over. The truth about the kidnapping, the years of trauma, and the path forward, those were battles yet to be fought. But for the first time in decades, Jake felt a glimmer of clarity. The woman he had once hated was no villain. She was a survivor, just like him. The small cemetery was quiet, the morning air heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. Jake stood in front of the newly placed headstone, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets as the wind tugged at his collar. The inscription was simple, yet profound. Ruth Miller, a survivor, a protector, 1945 to 2025. It had been weeks since Ruth's passing. Her injuries from that fateful night had been more severe than anyone realized, and despite the doctor's best efforts, her frail body couldn't endure the strain. Jake had stayed with her until the end, haunted by the soft, broken words she had whispered before slipping away. "I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt anyone." Her apology had left him reeling, the weight of it pressing down on him like a stone. For so long, he had clung to his hatred, using it as a shield against the pain of his past. But Ruth's death had forced him to confront the truth. She wasn't the monster he had built in his mind. She was a woman who had made impossible choices in a world that had been cruel to her at every turn. The fallout from that night had been swift. Thomas Miller was charged with a litany of crimes, including assault and illegal possession of a firearm. His connection to the decades-old kidnapping case was finally revealed, and the court sentenced him to life in prison without parole. Jake had testified at the trial, his words clear and steady as he recounted the horrors of his childhood and the role Ruth had played in saving him and the other children. But his testimony didn't stop there. Jake had insisted on telling the full story, not just about the kidnapping, but about Ruth's courage and the sacrifices she had made. He painted a picture of a woman who had risked everything to protect innocent lives, even at great personal cost. His words moved the courtroom, and though Ruth would never hear them, they felt like a necessary tribute to the woman she had been. Standing at her grave now, Jake felt a bittersweet ache in his chest. He wasn't sure if forgiveness was something he had fully grasped yet. Forgiving Ruth, forgiving himself, forgiving the broken system that had shaped both their lives. It was a process he was only beginning to understand. But he knew one thing for certain. Ruth deserved to be remembered not for her mistakes, but for her humanity. As he turned to leave, a small group of people approached. They were adults now, but their faces held traces of the children they had once been. The children Ruth had helped save all those years ago. Jake recognized them immediately. He had reached out to them after Ruth's death, urging them to come and pay their respects. One by one, they laid flowers at her grave, their faces etched with gratitude. A young woman with kind eyes knelt beside the headstone, her fingers tracing the engraved letters. "She saved us," she said softly, her voice trembling. "She didn't have to, but she did." Jake nodded, his throat tightening. "She saw something worth saving," he replied. The group lingered for a while, sharing quiet memories of the past, their voices mingling with the rustling leaves. For the first time in years, Jake felt a sense of peace. The darkness of his childhood had been illuminated by the light of Ruth's selflessness, and he could no longer deny the truth. Her actions had given him a second chance at life. As the crowd dispersed, Jake remained behind for a moment longer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered photo, a picture of himself as a child, smiling wide and carefree, taken just weeks before the kidnapping. He placed it gently at the base of the headstone. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight he hadn't been able to express before. "For everything." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead, and Jake could almost imagine Ruth's voice in the breeze, a quiet reassurance that, despite everything, she had found peace. With a final glance at the grave, Jake turned and walked away, the sunlight breaking through the clouds as he stepped into the warmth of a new day. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. Ruth's memory would stay with him, not as a source of pain, but as a reminder of the capacity for kindness and sacrifice that exists even in the darkest of places. She had been his protector, his savior, and now she was his guide, an angel watching over him as he moved forward, determined to honor her legacy.